The smell hit me first, rotting flesh mixed with sulfur and something else. Something sweet. I stood frozen in the lobby of the Cascade Inn, watching a creature with too many teeth check into room 237. Its claws scraped against the marble counter, leaving deep gouges in the stone. The night manager smiled. Professional. Calm. Welcome back, Mr. Vorthak. Your usual suite? The thing nodded, black ichor dripping from its maw onto the Persian rug. The stain spread like spilled wine, but the manager didn't flinch. I clutched the orientation packet in my sweating hands. Page 1 was simple enough. Rule number 1. Never look directly at the guests after midnight. But it was 11:47 p.m., and I was staring. The creature's head turned toward me with a wet, grinding sound. 6 yellow eyes locked onto mine. Its mouth opened wider, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that seemed to go on forever. The temperature in the lobby dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs as the thing took a step toward me, then another. The marble cracked under its weight. Rule number 2, I whispered, reading frantically from the packet. If a guest approaches you directly, recite the sanctuary pledge. But my throat had closed up. No words came. The creature was 3 feet away now. I could smell its breath, like burning hair and old blood. Its claws extended, each one the length of a kitchen knife. The manager cleared his throat. Mr. Vorthak, your key card. The thing stopped, turned back to the desk, took the plastic card with surprising delicacy. Enjoy your stay, the manager said. As the elevator doors closed behind the creature, I finally found my voice. What the hell was that? The manager straightened his tie, checked his watch. 11:52 p.m. Your first guest, Marcus, and you just broke 3 rules in under 5 minutes. He handed me a laminated card. Emergency protocols. The text was written in what looked like dried blood. Rule number 47. Staff members who violate guest privacy policies during their first shift will be assigned to the basement levels. I looked at the elevator buttons. Numbers 1 through 12. Then a basement level marked with a symbol I'd never seen before. Something howled from far below us. The manager smiled, but his eyes were cold as winter. Welcome to the Cascade Inn, Marcus. Your real orientation starts now. But what happened in that basement would change everything I thought I knew about monsters. In the heart of Tacoma, Washington, where the Puget Sound fog rolls thick as cemetery shrouds, stands an establishment that shouldn't exist. Shadowmere Inn, built in 1892 on land the Puyallup tribe warned settlers never to touch. Land where the veil between worlds grows thin as paper. For over a century, this Victorian mansion has operated under one simple premise. Monsters need somewhere to sleep, too. But hospitality for the inhuman comes with a price. Rules written in blood and binding contracts that stretch back to when Tacoma was nothing but timber mills and desperate dreams. The job posting appeared on Craigslist at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Night shift receptionist. No experience necessary. Excellent benefits. One requirement: absolute discretion. What they didn't mention was the smell of sulfur in the lobby, the way shadows moved independently of their owners, or how the elevator sometimes stopped at floors that didn't exist. Margaret Blackwood, the inn's proprietor for 43 years, had seen 17 receptionists come and go. Some quit after one night. Others simply vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone and terror. The rules existed for a reason. 27 carefully crafted commandments that kept the fragile peace between human staff and monstrous guests. Break them and the consequences weren't termination. They were consumption. Rule 1. Never look directly at a guest's true form. Rule 12. The ice machine on the 3rd floor is not for human use. Rule 27. If you hear children laughing after midnight, do not investigate. Each rule was written in response to a tragedy. Each violation had claimed a life. Tonight, Sarah Chen would walk through those mahogany doors for her interview, believing she was applying for a simple hotel job. She'd studied hospitality management at University of Washington, graduated with honors, had dreams of managing luxury resorts. She had no idea she was about to become the 18th receptionist at an establishment where checkout time was negotiable, but survival wasn't guaranteed. The brass nameplate by the entrance read simply, Shadowmere Inn, established 1892. What it didn't mention was the fine print written in languages that predated human civilization. Margaret adjusted her pearl necklace and checked the grandfather clock. 11 hours, 47 p.m., Sarah would arrive in 13 minutes, punctual as always. Margaret had been watching her for weeks, studying her routine, her character, her breaking point. Because at Shadowmere Inn, the interview process was less about qualifications and more about survival instincts. But the real test wouldn't begin until Sarah signed the contract. The leather-bound manual felt warm against my palms. Too warm. Mrs. Chen had left me alone in the lobby at 11:47 p.m., her footsteps echoing down the Victorian hallway until silence swallowed them whole. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed to grow louder with each second. I opened the manual. The first page made my stomach drop. Rule number 1. Never look directly at guest 237's reflection. The mirror in room 237 shows what they used to be. My hands trembled as I flipped the page. Rule number 2. If you hear children laughing in the basement after midnight, do not investigate. They are not children. The heating system groaned above me. Or was it groaning? Rule number 3. The guest in room 101 will ask for extra towels every night at 2:17 a.m. Give them exactly 3. Never ask why they're always covered in dirt. I checked my watch. 12:23 a.m. The rules continued, each one more disturbing than the last. Don't serve the pale woman in room 89 anything with garlic. The thing in room 45 only communicates through knocking. 1 knock means yes, 2 means no, 3 means run. Then I reached rule nursery 17. If a guest asks about the previous night clerk, tell them he went home to his family. Do not mention that he never had a family. Do not mention the screaming. The lobby suddenly felt colder. Much colder. I thought about Marcus, the guy who trained me for exactly 47 minutes before disappearing. He'd seemed nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. His final words echoed in my memory. Just follow the rules, and you might make it to morning. Might, a soft ding echoed through the lobby. The elevator doors slid open with a mechanical whisper. Empty? But the smell that drifted out, rotting flowers mixed with something metallic, made my eyes water. The elevator button panel glowed with an impossible floor number. 7. I flipped frantically through the manual, searching for guidance. Rule Sectors 23. When the elevator opens by itself, count to 30. If it closes before you finish counting, good. If it doesn't, the rest of the sentence was scratched out in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. 28. 29. The elevator doors remained open. A low, wet sound echoed from inside the shaft, like something large and soft hitting concrete. Again, and again. I looked down at the manual, my vision blurring with panic. The final rule, written in different handwriting, much shakier than the rest. Rule number 47. If you're reading this and the elevator won't close, you have approximately 90 seconds before the lights went out. But the real horror hadn't even begun. Rule 7 was crystal clear. Never enter a vampire's room during daylight hours. I'd memorized every protocol during my first week at the Tacoma Monster Inn. The laminated card in my pocket bore the crimson seal of management, 23 rules that kept us breathing. But Mrs. Chen was dying in room 237. The elderly vampire had checked in 3 nights ago, her pale hands trembling as she signed the registry. Ancient script flowed from her fountain pen like dried blood. She'd whispered about needing sanctuary, about hunters closing in. Now her emergency bell hadn't stopped ringing for 6 minutes. The brass button beside her door glowed angry red in the afternoon light. Each chime echoed through the Victorian corridors like a funeral dirge. Other guests were complaining. The werewolf pack in 201 had started howling in response. I stood frozen outside her door, master key burning in my sweaty palm. The scent of decay seeped through the oak panels. Something metallic and wrong, like copper pennies left in rain. My stomach churned as I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. Then a wet, choking sound. Protocol demanded I wait for nightfall. Call the vampire emergency line. Let the specialists handle it. But that gurgling noise, it sounded like drowning. I'd heard drowning before. My hand moved to the lock, before my brain could stop it. The key turned with a soft click that seemed to echo through my bones. The door swung open on perfect darkness. Blackout curtains blocked every photon of Seattle's gray afternoon. The air hit me like a wall, thick with the copper smell and something else, something ancient and hungry. Mrs. Chen? My voice cracked like a teenager's. A shape moved in the shadows. Too tall, too fluid. Then I saw her on the bed, or what remained of her. The emergency button lay crushed in her skeletal fingers, its red light still pulsing like a dying heartbeat. But vampires don't die during the day. They transform. The thing that had been Mrs. Chen turned toward me with eyes like burning coals. Her jaw unhinged with a wet crack, revealing rows of needle teeth that had never existed before. Rule 7 existed for a reason. I just learned why the hard way. But as I stumbled backward, my hand found something else in my pocket. Something management had never mentioned in orientation. Something that shouldn't exist. The leather-bound registry sits on the mahogany counter like a sleeping predator. Its pages are thick parchment, yellowed with age and something darker, something that makes my fingers stick when I turn each page. Rule number 7 haunts every night clerk. Never read the guest registry after midnight, but curiosity is a cancer that eats at you slowly. The first entry dates back to 1889. The ink is brown now, oxidized blood mixed with whatever passes for monster penmanship. The signature reads Bartholomew Ashworth in elegant script. Beneath his name, a single word, satisfied. I flip through decades of entries. Each signature grows more violent, more desperate. Claw marks tear through paper. Some names are written in languages that hurt to look at. Attempt 23, the widow Morrison. Her signature trails off into what looks like screaming. 1945. Something calling itself Father Wilhelm left teeth marks in the margin. 67. Lucy Chen wrote her name in perfect cursive, then drew 13 small circles beneath it. Each circle contains a child's face. The registry documents every monster that's passed through these halls, every creature that's paid our price, every soul that's found what they were looking for in room 237. But tonight, something's different. Tonight, there's a new entry. The ink is still wet, still warm. The signature reads clearly in my own handwriting. Marcus Rivera, night clerk. I don't remember writing it. I don't remember signing anything. Beneath my name, in that same familiar script, a single word stares back at me. Recruited. My hands shake as I touch the page. The ink smears, leaving crimson fingerprints across the parchment. The metallic taste fills my mouth as I realize what I'm looking at. This isn't ink. This is blood. My blood. The registry knows something I don't. Something about why I was really hired here. Something about what I'm becoming in this place where monsters check in, but humans don't always check out. I flip to the next page, desperate for answers. It's blank, except for tomorrow's date written in that same bloody script. Below it, a single line waits to be filled. Final entry. The grandfather clock in the lobby begins to chime midnight. Rule number 7 echoes in my mind as the 12th chime fades into silence. That's when I hear the footsteps coming down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. But according to the registry, all our guests checked out hours ago. The brass nameplate gleamed under the flickering hallway light. Room 237. I'd walked past this door 100 times during my first month at the Tacoma Monster Inn. Always kept my eyes down. Always followed the rules. But tonight was different. The guest in 238 had been screaming for 3 hours straight. Not the usual monster screams. Something else. Something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. My supervisor Marcus had vanished after the 2 a.m. check-in. Left me alone with 17 occupied rooms and a growing sense that something was very, very wrong. The screaming stopped. Silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton soaked in ice water. The hallway stretched before me. Burgundy carpet stained with things I'd learned not to question. That's when I heard it. Soft scratching from inside 237. Fingernails against wood. Deliberate, patient. Rule number 7 echoed in my mind. Never look directly at room 237. Not at the door. Not at the nameplate. Not at whatever might be looking back. But the scratching continued. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. My hand trembled as I reached for my master key. The metal felt wrong, too warm, like it had been sitting in someone's palm for hours. The scratching stopped. I pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the building's ancient heating system and the smell of sulfur that always lingered in this wing. Then I heard breathing, not the heavy labored breathing of the werewolf in 235, not the wheeze of the banshee in 241. This was human breathing. Terrified. Desperate. My training manual was clear. Rule number 7 existed for a reason. Every rule at the inn existed for a reason. The last employee who broke rule number 7 had been found 3 days later, catatonic, speaking only in numbers. 237, 237, but someone was in there, someone human, someone who needed help. I turned the key. The lock clicked with a sound like breaking bones. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing absolute darkness. No, not darkness. Something that ate light. Something that made the hallway behind me seem impossibly bright by comparison. And in that hungry void, 2 points of silver light blinked once, then smiled. That's when I realized the breathing I'd heard wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from behind me. The grandfather clock in the lobby struck midnight as I finished my rounds. Room 237 had been quiet all evening. Too quiet. The guest registry showed a simple name, Morgan Vale. But the signature kept changing every time I looked at it. First, elegant cursive. Then, sharp block letters. Now, jagged scratches that looked almost feral. Rule number 11 echoed in my mind. Never refuse a midnight request from room 237, no matter what they ask for. The call came at 12:03 a.m., front desk. My voice cracked despite 3 months of practice. I need you to bring me something. The voice was different from check-in. Deeper, older, like gravel scraping against bone. Of course, what can I? A mirror, the largest one you can find, and a photograph of yourself. My blood turned to ice water. The employee handbook had warned about this exact scenario. Page 47, highlighted in red ink. Shapeshifters require visual references for their work. Compliance is mandatory. I found the antique mirror in storage, 6 feet tall, ornate silver frame tarnished black at the edges. It took everything I had to drag it down the hallway without the glass shattering. The photograph was harder. My hands shook as I printed my employee ID photo from the office computer. Such a small thing. Just paper and ink. Why did it feel like I was signing my own death warrant? Room 237's door stood slightly ajar when I arrived. No light spilled out. Just darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the hallway's fluorescent glow. "Leave them outside," came the voice. But now it sounded exactly like mine. Perfect pitch, perfect inflection, even the slight lisp I'd had since childhood. I set down the mirror and slid the photograph under the door. The paper disappeared instantly, like something had been waiting. Silence stretched for 30 seconds. 60. 90. Then came the sound I'll never forget, wet, shifting noises. Bones cracking and reforming, skin stretching like rubber, and underneath it all, my own voice practicing my speech patterns. "Thank you for your service tonight. Have a pleasant evening. Front desk, how may I help you?" Each phrase more perfect than the last. I backed away slowly, remembering Rule Nupworkers 12. Never run from a shapeshifter. They interpret sudden movement as a challenge. But as I reached the elevator, one question burned through my terror. If the shapeshifter was learning to be me, what happened to the original? Rule number 7 was crystal clear. Kitchen access ends at 3 a.m. sharp. No exceptions. But Mrs. Holloway from room 204 was starving. The banshee had been wailing for hours, her ethereal form growing translucent with hunger. She needed fresh bone marrow, and she needed it now. I told myself I was being compassionate, professional even. The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking teeth. The kitchen stretched before me in absolute darkness. My flashlight beam cut through shadows that seemed to move independently, crawling across stainless steel surfaces like living things. The walk-in freezer hummed with an electrical frequency that made my molars ache. I stepped inside, breath misting in the sudden cold. Hanging meat swayed gently from hooks, though no breeze stirred the air. The bone marrow sat in neat plastic, containers on the bottom shelf. That's when I heard the whispers. Not words exactly, more like the sound of wind through a graveyard, carrying fragments of conversations from decades past. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees. My hands shook as I grabbed the container. The plastic felt warm against my frozen fingers, which made no sense at all. The whispers grew louder. Hungrier. I backed toward the freezer door, but it had swung shut behind me. The handle wouldn't budge. My flashlight flickered, casting dancing shadows that looked almost human. Then I understood why the kitchen stayed locked after 3 a.m. The whispers weren't coming from the meat. They were coming from the walls themselves. From the very bones of the building, where previous night shift workers had made the same mistake I was making right now. The inn didn't just house monsters. It fed on the staff who broke the rules. My breath came in sharp puffs as the walls began to close in. Not physically, but spiritually. I could feel the building's hunger pressing against my consciousness, like cold fingers probing for weakness. The bone marrow container slipped from my numb hands, shattering against the floor. That's when the freezer door finally opened. But what stood in the doorway wasn't Mrs. Holloway. It wasn't human at all. The grandfather clock in the lobby chimed 12 times, Each strike echoed through the Tacoma Inn's corridors like a death knell. I clutched the feeding cart, its wheels squeaking against the worn hardwood floors. The smell of raw meat and something else, something sweet and metallic, filled my nostrils. Rule number 7 had been clear. Between midnight and 3 a.m., deliver sustenance to room 237. Do not look directly at the occupant. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not run. The cart felt heavier with each step. 3 months I'd worked here, 3 months of following rules that made no sense to anyone sane. But the pay was good, and in Tacoma's economy, you didn't ask questions about good pay. The hallway stretched endlessly before me. Dim sconces cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. The burgundy wallpaper, elegant during daylight hours, now appeared to pulse with a life of its own. Room 237's door stood slightly ajar. A low rumbling emerged from within, not quite a growl, not quite breathing, something between hunger and contentment. I knocked twice, as instructed. "Enter," came a voice like grinding stone. The door swung open at my touch. Inside, darkness thick as velvet swallowed the room. Only the occupant's eyes were visible, 2 amber orbs floating 8 feet above the floor. "You're new," the voice observed. I set the cart down carefully, hands trembling. 3 months, sir." "Ah, then you haven't learned the real rules yet?" My blood turned to ice water. "The written rules keep you alive," the creature continued. "But there are older rules, rules that predate this building, rules that predate this city." The amber eyes descended, slowly. "Rules about what happens when someone breaks protocol." I remembered Marcus, the previous night shift worker, how he'd simply vanished one Tuesday morning, how management had cleaned out his locker without explanation, how they'd posted the job opening that same afternoon. Marcus learned about the real rules. The creature whispered. The feeding cart rattled as something massive moved past it in the darkness. He thought he was clever, thought he could document what he saw here, thought he could expose us. I felt hot breath against my neck, but Marcus forgot the most important rule of all. The amber eyes were now level with mine, close enough to see my reflection in their depths. Some secrets are kept not by choice, but by necessity. Then I heard it, a familiar voice calling my name from somewhere deep within the room, Marcus's voice. But Marcus had been missing for 3 weeks. The crimson light bleeding through the lobby windows meant only one thing: Blood Moon Night. I clutched the special registry book, its leather binding warm against my trembling fingers. Rule Chapter 47 echoed in my mind. During Blood Moon events, all supernatural guests must check in using their true names. No aliases, no human disguises, no exceptions. The first arrival materialized at 11:47 p.m., a wraith whose form shifted like smoke, leaving frost patterns on the marble floor. Her voice scraped like fingernails on glass. Room for the night. I forced my hand steady as I opened the Blood Moon registry. The pages themselves seemed to pulse with dark energy, the ink appearing to move in the crimson moonlight. Name: Morning Veil of the Seventh Circle. The words burned themselves into the page before I could write them. My skin tingled where the ink touched air. Then came the others, a pack of werewolves, their human facades melting away in the lunar glow. Their alpha's eyes reflected the red moon as he growled his ancient pack name in a language that predated Tacoma by millennia. A vampire whose true name made the registry book bleed actual crimson onto my hands. The metallic smell filled my nostrils as I fought back nausea. Each signature in the Blood Moon book bound them to honesty, but it also bound them to something else, something the day shift never warned me about. By midnight, 17 creatures had signed in. The lobby reeked of sulfur and old graves. My shirt clung to my back with cold sweat. That's when I noticed the pattern. Every name in the registry was connected. Ancient enemies, blood feuds spanning centuries, creatures who had sworn to destroy each other, now trapped under the same roof. Rule Sector 47 wasn't just about honesty. It was about forcing them to confront their past. The Blood Moon Registry was a trap, and I had just locked 17 supernatural predators in a building together, each one knowing exactly who their enemies were. The elevator dinged softly. Footsteps echoed from the second floor. Something wet dripped from the ceiling onto my shoulder. I looked up at the security monitor. Room 237 was empty, but the vampire I just checked in was supposed to be there. The lobby lights flickered once, then went out completely. In the darkness, I heard 17 different growls, and realized the Blood Moon check-in was just the beginning. The third rule violation happened on a Tuesday night in November. I was restocking the silver-lined towels when Mrs. Chen burst through the staff door. Her usually perfect composure had cracked like ice on a frozen lake. "Room 237, she whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The guest, it's not what it claimed to be. The Doppelganger Inn's Rule 7 was crystal clear. Never question a guest's true form. But some monsters don't just bend rules, they shatter them entirely. I followed Mrs. Chen up the crimson-carpeted stairs, each step creaking like old bones. The temperature dropped 5 degrees with every floor we climbed. Room 237's door stood ajar. Inside, what had checked in as a traveling businessman now hung from the ceiling like a grotesque chandelier. Its limbs had elongated into impossible angles, skin rippling like water disturbed by stones. But that wasn't the violation. On the bed lay 3 perfect copies of the creature's original human form. Each one breathing, each one blinking, each one wearing the same confused expression of someone who'd just woken from a deep sleep. "Which one is real?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice barely audible above the wet, sliding sounds coming from the ceiling. The shapeshifter's true form pulsed with dark veins, its multiple eyes focusing on us with predatory intelligence. A sound emerged from its throat, not quite laughter, not quite screaming. Rule 7 existed for this exact reason. When you question what's real, reality starts to unravel. One of the human copies sat up, rubbing its eyes. Where am I? I was just at the airport." Another copy turned toward us, terror flooding its features. "Please, I don't understand what's happening." The third remained motionless, but its chest rose and fell with steady, human breathing. The creature above us began to descend, its elongated fingers trailing across the wallpaper like spider legs. The floral pattern started to bleed actual crimson. "Mrs. Chen," I whispered, backing toward the door. "Which rule covers this?" She pulled out the leather-bound handbook with trembling fingers. Pages flipped of their own accord, settling on Rule 12. When faced with multiple truths, choose the one that preserves the most innocent lives. The shapeshifter's laughter filled the room like broken glass. But then I noticed something that made my blood freeze. One of the human copies had no reflection in the antique mirror beside the bed, and it was smiling. "Mrs. Chen," I breathed. "I think we're looking at this backwards. The real question wasn't which copy was human. The question was, which one of us was still real? The basement had always been off limits." Rule number 7. Never enter the basement after midnight. Never question what's kept down there. But tonight, something was wrong. I pressed my ear against the heavy oak door, listening to the sounds that had woken me. Scratching, like claws against stone. then silence so complete it made my ears ring. The brass key felt ice cold in my trembling fingers. 3 months I'd worked at the Tacoma Monster Inn. 3 months of following every rule without question. Feed the shadow creatures at 3 a.m. sharp, never look directly at the guests in room 237. Keep the salt circles unbroken. But this sound, this wasn't normal. The lock clicked open with a whisper. Stale air rushed up from below, carrying the metallic taste of old blood and something else. Something sweet and rotting that made my stomach lurch. My flashlight beam cut through absolute darkness, revealing stone steps worn smooth by countless feet. Or claws. Each step creaked under my weight. The scratching grew louder. At the bottom, my light swept across a sight that froze my blood. Cages. Dozens of them stretching into the shadows. Most were empty, their doors hanging open like broken jaws. But not all. In the far corner, something moved. I crept closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. The beam trembled as it found the occupied cage. Inside sat a woman, not a monster. A human woman in a torn business suit, her dark hair matted with dried blood. She looked up at me with eyes that held too much knowledge, too much pain. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice like autumn leaves. I stumbled backward. "Who are you? What is this place?" She smiled, and I saw her teeth were filed to points. "I'm the previous night manager, the one who broke rule number 7. Her fingers wrapped around the bars. "They don't fire you here. They just relocate you." The scratching sound came again, closer now. "Run," she hissed, "before they add another cage." Footsteps echoed from the stairs behind me. Heavy. Deliberate. I turned to see Mr. Grimwald, the inn's owner, descending into the basement. His usually kind face was cold as winter stone. "Breaking rules has consequences, my dear employee," but what he did next shocked even me. The brass key to room 237 felt ice cold against my palm. Rule 17 stated it clearly. Never enter a shapeshifter's room during their molting hour. But the screaming had been going on for 3 hours. The hallway reeked of sulfur and something else. Something wet and organic, like meat left too long in summer heat. The burgundy carpet beneath my feet squelched with each step, absorbing sounds that shouldn't exist. I pressed my ear to the mahogany door. Silence. Then a voice. My voice. Speaking words I'd never said. "Please, just let me die." My blood turned to slush. The shapeshifter was wearing my form, learning my vocal patterns. But why was it begging? I turned the key. The room was a charnel house. Skin hung from the chandelier like party streamers. Bones littered the Persian rug in neat piles. And there, in the center of it all, sat something wearing my face, but its eyes were wrong. Ancient. Tired. "You're early," it said with my mouth. I wasn't finished yet. The creature's flesh rippled like water. I watched my own features melt away, revealing something underneath that made my sanity crack at the edges. "Do you know what I am?" it asked, its voice now a symphony of everyone who'd ever died in this room. I shook my head, unable to speak. "I'm the inn's memory keeper. Every guest who stayed here, every death, every scream, I preserve them all." It gestured to the skin decorating the walls. "These aren't victims. They're volunteers." My stomach lurched. Volunteers. The terminally ill. The suicidal. The broken. Its form shifted again, showing me faces I recognized from the guest registry. They come here to die with purpose, to become part of something eternal. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. This wasn't a monster's feeding room. It was a sanctuary. "The screaming you heard," it continued, reading my expression, "wasn't pain. It was rebirth. They shed their suffering here, and I preserve their essence, their stories, their humanity. I staggered backward, my worldview crumbling. Rule 17 isn't about protecting you from me, the shapeshifter said, its voice now gentle, almost paternal. It's about protecting this sacred process from interruption. The smell of sulfur faded, replaced by something else. Incense. Peace. But you're here now, it said, studying my face with those ancient eyes. So tell me, what brought you to my door during molting hour? I realized I didn't know the answer, but the shapeshifter smiled with a dozen different faces, and I understood that maybe I was about to find out. The crimson light seeped through every crack in the Tacoma Inn's walls. I pressed my back against the supply closet door, heart hammering against my ribs. The blood moon only came once every 13 months, and tonight I'd broken the most sacred rule. Never leave your post during the crimson hours. The floorboards above my head groaned under impossible weight. Something massive was moving through the guest quarters. The air tasted of copper and ancient earth, thick enough to choke on. Mrs. Holloway's warning echoed in my skull. The blood moon awakens things that should stay sleeping, things that have been guests here for centuries. I'd thought she was being dramatic. The old woman loved her ghost stories, but when room 237's door had started bleeding actual blood, seeping crimson rivulets down the hallway carpet, I'd panicked. Abandoned my desk. Ran. Now the temperature was dropping fast. My breath came out in visible puffs as something scraped along the ceiling tiles. Long, deliberate scratches, like claws testing the strength of old wood. The guest registry had listed room 237 as occupied by the Weeping Count since 1892. I'd always assumed it was some eccentric rich man's nickname. The scratching stopped. Silence pressed against. My eardrums like deep water. Even the building's ancient heating system had gone quiet. No hum of electricity. No distant traffic from the Tacoma streets. Just my ragged breathing and the wet sound of blood dripping. Then I heard the footsteps. Slow. Measured. Coming down the main staircase. Each step left a squelching sound, like boots walking through thick mud. But I knew what that sound really was. The same crimson substance that had been pouring from room 237. The footsteps paused at the bottom of the stairs. I could smell it now. Not just copper, but something older. Decay mixed with expensive cologne. The scent of something that had been beautiful once, long ago. A voice drifted through the darkness. Cultured. European. Infinitely sad, little innkeeper. You've left your post. The doorknob to my hiding place began to turn. Slowly. Deliberately, and I realized with growing horror that Mrs. Holloway had never told me what happened to staff members who broke the blood moon rule. But I was about to find out. The emergency alarm pierced through the Shadowmere Inn like a banshee's wail. I clutched the master key ring, my hands trembling as the brass keys clinked together in the darkness. Rule number 7 echoed in my mind. If the containment alarm sounds, all staff must immediately conduct a floor-by-floor and weep. But no one had told me what happens when you find what escaped. The third-floor corridor stretched before me like a throat waiting to swallow. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the wallpaper seemed to writhe in the shadows. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since the alarm started. Something wet dripped from the ceiling. I looked up. Dark stains spread across the ornate plaster like spilled wine, but the metallic smell told a different story. My stomach lurched as another drop landed on my cheek. Warm. Thick. Definitely not water. Room 317's door hung open, the reinforced steel frame twisted like paper. Deep gouges scarred the walls, claw marks that went straight through to the wooden beams beneath. Whatever had been contained here possessed strength that defied physics. My radio crackled. "Sarah, report your status. Third floor clear so far," I whispered, stepping over shattered glass, "but 3 West 17 is compromised." "Copy that. Continue sweep. Remember the protocols." Protocols. Right. As if the employee handbook covered hunting escaped nightmares through a monster hotel. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I approached room 319. The door was intact, but something had written on it in that same dark substance from the ceiling. Words in a language that hurt to look at directly. I fumbled for my translation app, but the symbols shifted and crawled whenever I tried to focus. Then I heard it. Breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from inside 319. But according to my clipboard, that room was supposed to be empty tonight. Our guest wasn't scheduled to arrive until tomorrow. I pressed my ear to the door. The breathing stopped. Complete silence. Then, a voice from directly behind the door, inches from my face. "Sarah, why don't you come in?" It knew my name, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was recognizing the voice. It was mine. The basement door's brass handle felt ice cold against my palm. 3 months working at the Tacoma Monster Inn, and I'd never broken rule number 7. Never enter the basement after midnight. But Mrs. Grimwald's screams had stopped too suddenly. The wooden steps groaned under my weight. Each creak echoed like gunshots in the narrow stairwell. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and something else. Something metallic that made my stomach clench. At the bottom, emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red. Rows of glass containers lined the walls, each one filled with murky fluid. Inside them, shapes floated. Human shapes, but they weren't dead. Their eyes followed me as I moved deeper into the room. Fingers pressed against glass from the inside. Mouths opened and closed in silent screams, creating streams of bubbles that rose to the surface. Mrs. Grimwald stood at the far end, her back to me. Her usual floral dress was splattered with dark stains. In her hands, she held a clipboard, checking off items like a grocery list. "Room 237 needs a new liver," she muttered, her voice carrying that same cheerful tone she used when serving breakfast. "And the gentleman in 445 specifically requested young kidneys." I tried to step backward, but my foot caught something soft. Looking down, I saw a pile of clothes. Fresh clothes. The kind guests wore when they checked in. That's when I understood rule number 12. Guests who don't follow the rules become part of the inn's permanent collection. Mrs. Grimwald's reflection appeared in the glass containers. She was smiling that same grandmother smile, but her teeth were too sharp now. Too many. "Oh, dear," she said, turning slowly. "You really shouldn't have come down here, Marcus." The containers began to glow brighter. The shapes inside pressed harder against the glass. Cracks appeared, spiderwebbing across multiple surfaces. "But don't worry," she continued, pulling a fresh tag from her apron. "We have such wonderful guests upstairs who've been asking about you specifically." Above us, I heard the breakfast bell ring. 6 a.m. sharp. Morning shift was starting, but Mrs. Grimwald was already reaching for the largest empty container. That's when I realized the most important rule of all, the one they never wrote down. Some jobs, you don't quit. They quit you. The emergency alarm pierced through the inn's ancient walls at 3:47 a.m. I stumbled down the service stairs, my flashlight cutting through darkness thick as velvet. The basement sanctuary, our last refuge when the surface world became too dangerous for our guests, had never been breached. Until tonight. Rule 23 echoed in my mind. If the sanctuary alarm sounds, evacuate all human staff immediately. Do not attempt rescue. But Mrs. Chen was down there, the basement door hung open, its reinforced steel twisted like paper. Claw marks gouged deep into the concrete walls, still warm to the touch. The air reeked of sulfur and something else, fear, sharp and metallic. I descended anyway. The sanctuary's soft blue lighting flickered erratically. Emergency crystals embedded in the walls pulsed like a dying heartbeat. Our most vulnerable guests had sheltered here. The young shapeshifters still learning control, the elderly vampires too weak for hunting. Now their beds lay empty, sheets torn and bloodied. Mrs. Chen? My voice cracked against the stone. A wet dragging sound answered from the far corner. I found her behind the overturned medicine cabinet, clutching a silver-tipped syringe. Her uniform was shredded, revealing deep gashes across her arms. But she was breathing. "The purifiers," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They knew about the sanctuary. They knew exactly where to find us." My blood turned to ice water. The purifiers were human extremists who viewed our inn as an abomination. But they'd never penetrated our defenses before, never found the sanctuary's hidden entrance. Someone told them, Mrs. Chen continued, gripping my arm with surprising strength. Someone gave them the blueprints, the ward patterns, everything. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell above us. I helped Mrs. Chen to her feet, my mind racing through possibilities. Who had access to sanctuary protocols? Who knew the ward configurations? The footsteps grew closer. "There's something else," Mrs. Chen breathed against my ear. "The guests they took, they didn't kill them. They loaded them into transport vehicles, like they were collecting specimens." A shadow fell across the sanctuary entrance. "And I know who's been feeding them information." The footsteps stopped. Mrs. Chen pressed a folded paper into my palm, her eyes wide with terror. Then the lights went out completely. But what I read on that paper in the darkness changed everything I thought I knew about the inn. The employment contract sat on Marcus's desk like a death warrant. 3 days had passed since the Minotaur incident. 3 days of sleepless nights and the metallic taste of fear coating his tongue. Mrs. Blackthorne had summoned him to her office at precisely 3:17 a.m. The grandfather clock's chimes still echoed in the mahogany-paneled room when she slid the document across her desk. "Read Clause 17 carefully," she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. Marcus's hands trembled as he lifted the parchment. The paper felt warm. Too warm, like skin. The ink seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, words rearranging themselves before his eyes. But Clause 17 remained perfectly clear. Upon breach of confidentiality or abandonment of duties, the employee's life essence shall transfer to the inn's foundation, strengthening the barriers between realms. "You're saying if I quit," Marcus's voice cracked. "You die," Mrs. Blackthorne finished matter-of-factly. "Your soul becomes part of the inn's protective ward system. Quite painless, I'm told." The room spun. Every strange rule suddenly made horrifying sense. The previous night, clerk who'd transferred to another location. The maintenance worker who'd found better opportunities. They were still here. In the walls, in the foundation. Marcus could feel them now. Whispers in the heating vents. Shadows that moved wrong. The constant sensation of being watched. 43 employees over the past century, all bound by the same clause. "But why tell me now?" he whispered. Mrs. Blackthorne's smile revealed teeth too sharp for humanity. "Because you've been asking questions, Marcus, about the rules, about what happens to those who break them." She leaned forward, her eyes reflecting lamplight like a cat's. The Minotaur wasn't the only thing that escaped last week. Something else slipped through when you hesitated to follow protocol. Something that feeds on doubt and fear. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Marcus's breath misted as he spoke. What escaped? A doubt wraith. It's been whispering to you, hasn't it? Making you question everything. Making you want to run. Marcus's blood turned to ice. The voice in his head these past 3 days, the one telling him to flee, to expose the inn's secrets, to break every rule. It wasn't his voice at all. The wraith feeds on rebellion, Mrs. Blackthorne continued, and when it's done feeding, it possesses its host completely. She stood, walking to the window overlooking Tacoma's sleeping streets. You have until sunrise to make your choice, Marcus. Follow the rules and live, or let the wraith complete its feast. But what she didn't tell him was that the choice had already been made. The clock above the front desk read 5:47 a.m. when I heard it, a sound like wind chimes made of bone, clicking, scraping, getting closer. I'd been awake for 36 hours straight, my shift extending into something that felt more like a test than employment. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. My hands shook as I gripped the leather-bound rulebook. Rule 23 stared back at me in faded ink. When dawn approaches, the final guest always arrives. Do not look directly at them, do not speak their name, do not ask what they carry in the black case. The lobby lights flickered. Outside, Tacoma's skyline began to blush with the first hint of sunrise. The Space Needle stood like a sentinel against the bleeding sky. But here, in the Shadowmere Inn, dawn meant something different, something worse. The bone-wind chime sound grew louder, closer. I could smell it now, ozone and burnt copper like lightning striking old pennies. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. The ancient radiators groaned in protest. Then I saw the shadow. It moved wrong. Too fluid, too purposeful. It slid across the lobby floor like spilled ink, defying every law of physics I'd ever learned. The shadow had weight. I could hear its footsteps. My peripheral vision caught movement by the entrance. A figure in a long coat stood silhouetted against the dawn light. Tall, impossibly thin. In their left hand they carried a black briefcase that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I remembered Marcus's words from my first night. The final guest isn't really a guest at all. They're a collector. The figure's head turned toward me. Every instinct screamed to look directly at them, to see their face, to understand what stood in my lobby at the edge of dawn. But Rule 23 held me frozen. The bone chime sound intensified. The briefcase clicked open. I squeezed my eyes shut and counted my heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. When I opened them, the lobby was empty, but on the front desk sat a single black envelope. My name was written across it in silver ink that seemed to move in the lamplight. Inside, I knew, would be my final test. But as I reached for the envelope, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, coming from upstairs, where all the guest rooms were supposed to be empty. 6 a.m. sharp. The grandfather clock in the lobby chimes as I unlock the front desk drawer. Rule 17 echoes in my mind. Never let the morning shift see what happened during the night. I spray bleach across the marble floor where something dark had pooled. The chemical burn hits. My nostrils, mixing with the lingering smell of sulfur and wet earth, my hands shake as I scrub. 3 hours ago, a guest in room 237 had molted. The entire hallway carpet needed replacing. The brass key to the supply closet feels ice cold against my palm. Inside, industrial-strength cleaners line the shelves like soldiers. Bottles labeled things the day shift doesn't need to know about. Essence neutralizer. Memory foam dissolver. Temporal stain remover. Footsteps echo from the employee entrance. Sarah's voice carries through the service corridor, bright and cheerful. She's talking to Marcus about weekend plans. They have no idea what this place becomes after midnight. I stuff the bloodied towels into the incinerator chute. The flames below roar to life, hungry and efficient. Ash floats up like gray snow. The elevator dings. Sarah emerges, coffee in hand, humming some pop song. Her badge reads Day Manager in clean, professional letters. "Morning, Alex." She beams. "Quiet night?" Rule 17 burns in my throat. Never let the morning shift see what happened during the night. Dead quiet. I lie. She doesn't notice the fresh paint on the wall where claw marks had gouged deep grooves. Doesn't see how the chandelier hangs slightly crooked after something with wings had crashed through it. Marcus joins us, straightening his tie. His eyes are clear, rested. No dark circles, no haunted expression. "Any messages?" he asks, checking the pristine guest registry. I hand him the sanitized logbook. Every entry from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. has been carefully omitted. The pages show nothing but peaceful check-ins and routine maintenance. Sarah starts her morning inspection, clipboard in hand. She walks past room 237 without pausing. The door looks normal now. Fresh paint, new nameplate, no scorch marks. The sprinkler system had worked perfectly. I watch them begin their shift, moving through their familiar routines. Checking inventory, reviewing reservations, planning the continental breakfast. They live in a world where monsters are just stories, where the Moonrise Inn is just another boutique hotel in downtown Tacoma, where the night shift handles nothing more dangerous than drunk guests and broken ice machines. My replacement arrives at 7, fresh-faced, eager, completely unprepared. I gather my things, heading for the employee exit. The morning sun streams through the lobby windows, warm and golden. But as I reach the door, the elevator dings again. Something steps out that shouldn't exist in daylight. The bathroom mirror in room 237 wasn't supposed to exist. I discovered this at 5:47 a.m. when the cleaning schedule forced me into the Wraith's quarters before sunrise. The brass nameplate read, "Maintenance only, dawn hours." But Mrs. Holloway's instructions were clear: clean every surface. Follow every rule, never ask questions. The Wraith had checked out 3 hours earlier, leaving behind the usual: sulfur stains on the bed sheets, claw marks in the wooden headboard, and that metallic taste in the air that made your teeth ache. But the bathroom was wrong. A mirror hung where the rule sheet specifically stated there should be none. Victorian silver backing, ornate frame carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The reflection showed my face. Then it showed something else. My grandfather stood behind me, wearing his old Navy uniform. The same uniform he'd been buried in 40 years ago. His eyes were black holes, and when he smiled, I could see every tooth had been filed to a point. "You shouldn't be here, Tommy," he whispered, though his lips didn't move in the reflection. I spun around. The bathroom was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, my grandfather was gone. But written in the condensation on the glass, in handwriting I recognized as my own, were 3 words: "You work here." The letters began to drip like blood. That's when I understood. The inn didn't just house monsters, it created them. Every employee who'd worked here longer than 6 months, every night clerk who'd followed the rules without question, every housekeeper who'd cleaned up after things that shouldn't exist. We weren't the staff, we were the inventory. The mirror showed me what I was becoming. My reflection had changed. My eyes were darker, pupils dilated like a predator's. My fingernails had grown longer, sharper. When I smiled, testing the theory, my canine teeth had extended into fangs. Mrs. Holloway's voice echoed from the hallway. "Tommy, is the Wraith's room ready?" I looked at my hands. Normal. Human. I touched my teeth. blunt and ordinary. But in the mirror, the monster version of myself was still there, grinning. It mouthed 2 words. Almost ready. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and ran from the room, but I could hear it laughing behind me. The sound followed me down the hallway, growing louder with each step. That was 3 days ago. Now every mirror in Tacoma shows me the same thing. But the real horror hadn't even begun. The revelation came at 3:17 a.m. when Mrs. Blackthorne found me crying in the supply closet. Not because of the rules I'd broken, not because of the guests I'd failed to serve properly, but because I finally understood what they'd been trying to tell me all along. "You smell like us," the shadow thing had whispered on my first night. I'd thought it meant fear, the metallic tang of terror that clung to every human who worked here. I was wrong. Mrs. Blackthorne's ancient fingers traced the air above my shoulder, never quite touching. Her milky eyes saw what I'd spent 22 years refusing to acknowledge. "Rule 0 was never about protecting them from you, dear," she said, her voice soft as moth wings. "It was about protecting you from yourself." The memory crashed over me like ice water. My mother's final words before the accident. The way she'd looked at me in that hospital bed, her pupils dilated with morphine and something else. Something like recognition. "The hunger will come," she'd whispered. "When it does, find the inn. They'll understand." I'd thought she was delirious. Dying people say strange things, but the guests had known from the moment I walked through those doors. The way they watched me wasn't predatory. It was protective, cautious. The way you'd watch a sleeping volcano. The werewolf in 237 had left raw meat outside my door every full moon. Not as a threat, as an offering. The vampire in the penthouse had gifted me blackout curtains for my apartment. "For when the sensitivity starts," he'd said with knowing eyes. Even the poltergeist had been gentle with me, moving objects just enough to catch my attention. Teaching me to see beyond the veil. They were preparing me. My hands shook as the pieces fell into place, the way I could see through their glamours. How I instinctively knew which rules applied to which guests. Why breaking Rule 17 hadn't killed me. It had awakened something. The hunger Mrs. Blackthorne mentioned wasn't metaphorical. It was growing in my chest like a living thing, cold and patient and utterly alien. My reflection in the supply closet mirror showed eyes that weren't quite human anymore. Pupils too wide. Too dark. Too hungry. "What am I becoming?" I whispered. Mrs. Blackthorne smiled, revealing teeth that had never been human. "Something wonderful, dear. Something the inn has been waiting for." The hunger pulsed, and for the first time I didn't fight it. That was my first mistake. The basement door stood open. After 6 months of following the rules, of pretending I didn't hear the screams from below, I finally descended those concrete steps. The smell hit me first. Copper and ozone. The metallic tang of something ancient and wrong. 15 cells lined the corridor. Each one held a different nightmare. A woman with too many teeth smiled at me through rusted bars. Her fingernails had grown into claws that scraped against stone as she moved. "New keeper," she whispered. "We've been waiting." The truth crystallized like ice in my chest. The Tacoma Inn wasn't shelter for monsters. It was a prison. Manager Patricia appeared beside me, her footsteps silent on the damp floor. "Surprised? You shouldn't be. Rule number 1 always told you everything you needed to know. Never ask what's in the basement, because once you knew, you became complicit. These creatures terrorized Tacoma for decades," Patricia explained, her voice echoing off wet walls. "The city made a deal in 1987. We contain them. They fund us. Everyone pretends the monsters don't exist. 23 supernatural entities. Captured, cataloged, caged. The thing in Cell 7 had murdered 12 children before they caught it. Cell 12 housed something that fed on memories, leaving its victims as empty shells, and I had been feeding them. Every meal delivery, every cleaned room, every followed rule. I was their warden now. The previous night clerk lasted 3 years, Patricia said, watching my face. Before the guilt drove him to, well, we found him in the Puget Sound. The weight of 23 lives pressed against my shoulders. Not just the monsters below, but their victims. The families who never got answers. The city that chose willful blindness over justice. You have a choice, Patricia continued. Walk away tonight. Forget what you've seen. Or stay and help us maintain the balance. The creature in Cell 1 laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I thought of every true crime podcast I'd ever consumed, every documentary about serial killers and missing persons, how audiences devoured horror from the safety of their screens. We all love monsters, as long as they're someone else's problem, as long as someone else keeps them locked away. Now I understood the final rule, the one Patricia never wrote down. Once you know the truth, you can never leave. In our modern world of viral videos and social media justice, we still choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. How many monsters walk free because we'd rather not look too closely? Some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone. The new girl's hands shake as I hand her the laminated rules. She's 19, fresh-faced, still believes the world makes sense. Rule 1. I begin, my voice steady after 3 years of this ritual. Never look directly at the guest in room 237. The weeping woman doesn't like to be seen. She nods eagerly, pen poised over her notepad. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead. The building groans. Rule 17, I continue. If you hear children laughing in the basement, ignore it. There are no children here. There never were. Her pen stops moving. I remember my first night. How Sarah, the previous trainer, had seemed so calm, so normal. How she'd smiled when she handed me these same rules. I found Sarah's body 3 months later. Torn apart in room 237. Rule 23, I say, watching the girl's face pale. If a guest asks you to come inside their room, politely decline. Some hungers can never be satisfied. The smell of sulfur drifts down the hallway. Something howls in the distance. She looks up at me with wide, terrified eyes. How many rules are there? 47, I whisper. But you'll only need to know them for about 6 months. 6 months? I lean closer. The truth tastes like copper on my tongue. That's when you'll start training your replacement. Her face crumbles. Understanding floods her features. The inn doesn't just house monsters, I continue, my voice hollow. It creates them. Every night shift worker who's lasted more than 6 months, we stop being human, piece by piece, rule by rule. I pull back my sleeve. My arm is covered in scales that shimmer in the artificial light. Sarah trained me. Before her, it was Marcus. Before him, Jennifer. We're all still here, still working, still following the rules. The girl drops her pen. It clatters against the linoleum. The monsters you'll serve? They used to be just like you. Eager, innocent, human. I hand her the master key. It burns cold against her palm. Welcome to the inn, sweetheart. Your transformation begins tonight. She stares at the key, then at me, then at the endless hallway stretching into darkness. In our modern world of gig economies and soul-crushing service jobs, we tell ourselves we're just surviving, just paying rent, just getting by. But what happens when the job doesn't just take your time? What happens when it takes your humanity? Every clock in is a choice. Every shift, a small death. Subscribe if you dare to question what you're really trading for that paycheck.